The mare's scream cut through desert morning like something dying high, wrong, terrified in a way that made Sarah's hands freeze on the feed bucket before her brain could process why. She ran. Boots kicking up dust, heart already slamming against ribs, that old ER nurse instinct screaming, "Check the patient, check the patient, check the patient." When she reached the paddock fence, the feed bucket slipped from numb fingers. Barbed wire. Fresh. Gleaming in brutal Arizona sun like a smile made of knives, strung across the water trough entrance exactly where Juniper, 16 years old, therapy horse, survivor of neglect before Sarah rescued her, would lower her gray muzzle to drink. Blood streaked the mare's face. Not deep, deliberate. Sarah's vision tunneled. Her hands started shaking, the same tremor that used to hit after 12-hour shifts in Banner Medical's ER after she'd lost a patient despite doing everything right. After her body remembered that sometimes your best isn't enough. Not now. Not the shaking. Not when Juniper needs you. She clipped the wire with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. Gentle voiced the panicked horse, "Check the cuts. Superficial. Lucky. An inch lower and they'd have severed the artery." That's when she saw the notice. Laminated. Gold seal. Taped to the fence post like a threat gift wrapped in bureaucracy. Notice. Desert Vista Estates Extended Wellness District requires therapeutic facilities to obtain HOA licensing. Monthly inspection fees apply. Non-compliance equals cease operations. Victoria Hartwell, President. Sarah read it 3 times. Each time, her pulse spiked higher. Each time, that old familiar feeling crept up her spine, the one from the ER when a patient coded and you knew someone had made a mistake, but the paperwork said everything was done correctly. She pulled out her phone, photographed the wire. The blood, the notice. Her hands shook so badly the first 2 photos were blurred. Deep breath. You've held hearts that were still beating. You can handle a clipboard, tyrant. But the shaking wouldn't stop. 7 years ago, Sarah had been someone else. Someone married, stable, planning, retirement. Someone who believed that if you followed the rules and worked hard and loved fiercely, life would reward you with safety. Then her husband left. Not dramatically, just a Tuesday morning confession over coffee that he'd been unhappy for years, that he'd met someone younger, that he was sorry but he needed to be honest now before it was too late. 24 years, gone between breakfast and lunch. The divorce therapist, Dr. Reyes, who had kind eyes and too much experience with women like Sarah, had suggested buying something alive to care for. Something that doesn't need explanations. The ranch had been a foreclosure. 20 Scottsdale acres, broken fences, sand-filled troughs, a barn leaning like exhaustion. Sarah had walked the property at sunset, watching the Superstition Mountains turn purple, and felt something in her chest unclench for the first time in months. She'd bought it with insurance money from her father, a Vietnam vet who'd taught her that healing happens when you give broken things something to hold on to. 3 rescue horses became 16. Therapeutic riding certification. A non-profit. Kids with autism. Veterans with PTSD. Trauma survivors relearning trust. Safe Haven Ranch. Built from dirt and hope and the stubborn belief that broken things could heal if you just gave them space. Now, someone wanted to take it. Sarah called her attorney, Linda Vasquez, who'd handled the divorce with the efficiency of someone who'd seen every flavor of human cruelty. Barbed wire? Linda repeated flatly. At a therapy horse's water source. With an HOA notice about fake licensing fees. Silence. Then, that's not harassment. That's criminal. File a police report. I'll start building a case. The deputy who showed up was young, polite, and utterly useless. He photographed the wire, took her statement, and said the words that made Sarah's jaw ache from clenching. Without witnesses, hard to prove who did this. Could have been vandals, kids, anyone really. It was taped to a fence with an HOA notice. The notice isn't illegal, ma'am. Just paperwork. He closed his notebook. Best thing, talk to the HOA. Work it out, neighborly. After he left, Sarah stood in the barn aisle with her hands still shaking and realized something cold. She was on her own. That night she couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made her flinch. Horses spooked, someone returning, another attack. She walked the property 3 times with a flashlight, checking fences, gates, anywhere someone could hurt the animals she'd sworn to protect. At 3 a.m., she gave up and started researching. Pulled every document, deed, business licenses, therapeutic certifications, nonprofit status, everything legal, everything documented, everything hers. But as sunrise painted the Superstition Mountains rust gold, she felt the first real twist of fear, because people like Victoria Hartwell didn't play by legal rules, they rewrote them. The email arrived 3 days later. Subject line: Violation Notice, Maricopa County Environmental Health. Sarah read it standing in the barn, phone in one hand, grooming brush in the other. That old ER training the only thing keeping her upright. Following complaint Safe Haven Ranch inspection required for improper waste management, inadequate fly control, potential groundwater contamination, failure to maintain distance from residential areas, failure to schedule within 10 days equals cease operations. Her vision grayed at the edges. The grooming brush clattered to the concrete floor. She ran a clean facility, manure composted properly, fly traps in every aisle, well water tested quarterly, and distance requirements? This was county land. There were no distance requirements unless you were a commercial feedlot. The phone rang, Linda. Don't panic, Linda said, which meant panic was appropriate. This is a pattern. I ran Victoria Hartwell through court records. 7 property disputes in 5 years with adjacent landowners, 6 settled. 1 guy fought back, buried in violations until he sold at a loss. So that's her strategy. It's called lawfare, using the legal system as harassment. Linda paused. Sarah, even with me working reduced fees, fighting this properly costs $30,000 minimum. Do you have that? Sarah looked at the ranch. Horses grazing, barn she'd rebuilt herself, kids who finally felt safe here. No, she said quietly. I don't. After hanging up, she sat in her truck with the engine off, hands on the steering wheel, breathing through the panic that tasted like metal and failure. You've held dying patients. You've made impossible decisions in the ER. You can figure this out. But what if she couldn't? What if this was the one time being stubborn wasn't enough? Her phone buzzed. Text from Marcus, the Iraq vet who'd stopped having nightmares after working with Thunder. Just checking in. Ranch has been my lifeline. Thank you. Sarah closed her eyes, breathed. Decided they picked the wrong fight. She spent the next week documenting everything. Every violation notice, every county filing, building a case. That's when she found it. Buried in Desert Vista's zoning amendment, an extended wellness district expansion approved 18 months ago. The signature? Robert Hartwell, County Planning Commissioner, Victoria's husband. Linda called it regulatory capture. They used public office to expand private authority. That's not just unethical, it's illegal. Can we prove it? We can expose it, but exposing it would make Victoria desperate, and desperate people burn things down. The fire started at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday. Sarah's phone screamed barn heat sensor alarm, and she ran barefoot across gravel that tore her feet open, ran toward orange light bleeding into desert night, ran toward the sound of horses screaming in a way that 16 years of ER trauma hadn't prepared her for. The barn was burning. West wall. Hay storage. 16 horses locked in stalls. She got Juniper out first, then Daisy, Spirit, Thunder. Each trip back into smoke that burned her lungs, heat that singed her eyebrows, flames that licked at the edges of her vision. Each time thinking, this is it, this is how I die. But she'd held beating hearts in her hands. She'd breathed for people who couldn't breathe themselves. This was the same thing, just move, just save them, deal with the cost later. 12 horses out, 13, 14. On the 15th trip, the roof collapsed. Support beam crashed 3 feet from where she stood with Butterfly's halter. Embers rained like hell's confetti. "Come on, baby," she whispered through ruined vocal cords. "Please." Butterfly followed her out. Then the last one. 16 horses. All alive. Sarah collapsed in the dirt, surrounded by panicked animals, coughing smoke and something that might have been laughter or crying, or both. Her hands still shaking, always shaking, pressed against concrete, hot enough to burn. The volunteer fire chief found her there. Older man, kind eyes, seen too many fires. "You're lucky," he said. Lucky. The word tasted like ash. Preliminary assessment. Electrical fire. Old wiring. Dry hay. Desert heat. It happens. I rewired 8 months ago. To code. County inspected. Wiring can fail even when new, ma'am. There's a HOA president trying to steal my land, Sarah said. Voice wrecked from smoke. 3 weeks ago, barbed wire in my trough. 2 weeks ago, fake county violations. Yesterday, her lawyer called offering to buy me out before more accidents happen. And now my barn burns. She pulled out her phone with blistered fingers. Showed him Victoria's text. Accidents happen on poorly maintained properties. Sell before someone gets hurt. The chief's expression shifted. I'll need to keep that phone as evidence. Make copies. I'm keeping the original. Ma'am? I'm a nurse, Sarah interrupted. I know what evidence looks like, and I know what murder attempts look like. This wasn't an electrical fire. This was arson. After he left, she found the tire tracks. Fresh. Deep treads in mud that had been dry yesterday. She photographed them from every angle with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, wouldn't stop remembering the heat, wouldn't stop feeling like maybe this time she'd pushed too hard and lost everything. Linda arrived at dawn, took one look at Sarah, covered in soot, hands blistered, eyes hollow, and just hugged her. They tried to burn me out, Sarah said into Linda's shoulder. They failed. My barn's gone. Everything's gone. Your horses are alive. You're alive. That's not nothing, but it felt like nothing. It felt like Sarah had spent 7 years building something that mattered, and someone had destroyed it in under an hour because they wanted her land. That night, Sarah sat in her ruined barn, surrounded by ash, and broke. Not crying. Worse. That hollow feeling that comes after you've given everything and it still wasn't enough. The same feeling from her divorce, like she'd failed at something fundamental and couldn't fix it no matter how hard she tried. Her phone buzzed. The Morrison twins' mother saw the news. Is the ranch closing? My boys finally started speaking around the horses. Please don't close. Then Marcus saved my life. Tell me how to help. Then 12 more messages. Families. Veterans. Kids with autism who'd found their voices here. Sarah looked at her hands, blistered, shaking, useless, and thought about the ER, about the patients she'd lost despite doing everything right, about the ones she'd saved. When everyone said it was hopeless, you don't quit when someone's dying. You work until there's nothing left to try. She picked up her phone and started typing. This was Safe Haven Ranch 24 hours ago. Tonight it burned. They're calling it an accident. Here's why it wasn't. She posted everything. Photos of the barbed wire, fake violations, Victoria's threatening texts, the burned barn, the tire tracks. Then, she tagged every news station, every advocacy group, every person who'd ever said they believed in fighting back, and pressed post. The story went viral within hours. By morning, TV crews were calling. By noon, Linda was fielding interview requests. By evening, Sarah stood in front of cameras with her burned barn behind her, exhausted and covered in soot, telling Victoria Hartwell's story to anyone who would listen. But Victoria was already planning her counterattack. The response came fast, Victoria's lawyer on every news channel spinning the narrative. Miss Mitchell's tragic fire was caused by her own negligence. Desert Vista HOA offered repeatedly to help her meet safety standards. She refused. Now she's trying to blame others for her own failures. They had photos, evidence of violations. Testimonials from neighbors about concerning conditions. Sarah watched the interviews from her truck, hands still shaking, wondering if maybe they were right. Maybe she had been negligent. Maybe the fire was her fault for not. Her phone rang. Unknown number. Miss Mitchell? Martin Torres. Retired FBI. I've been documenting Desert Vista for 2 years. Your fire just gave me probable cause to take this federal. He showed up the next morning, older man, calm presence, folders of evidence showing Victoria's pattern of harassment, fraud, and suspicious fires at 3 other properties. She's done this before, he explained. Harass, intimidate, destroy. You're number 4, but you're the first one fighting back publicly. Can you prove arson? Maybe, but I can prove RICO conspiracy, pattern of racketeering. That's federal prison time. Over the next week, Martin and Linda built a case that was beautiful and brutal. Emails where Victoria told her husband to handle the horse problem. Financial records showing fraudulent expansion, victim testimony from 3 other property owners Victoria had destroyed. And then they found Victoria's mistake, an email to her husband saying, once the horse property burns, we can move. Phase 4. Fire marshal won't look too closely, he owes us. She'd written it down, actually documented her intent to commit arson. She's going to prison, Martin said. But Sarah didn't feel victorious. She felt tired. Tired and scared and so angry she couldn't breathe properly. What do I do now? She asked Linda. You decide if this is worth fighting for. Sarah looked at her burned barn. At volunteers already showing up to help rebuild. At Marcus organizing a group of veterans. At the Morrison twins' hand-drawn card saying, we love the horses, it's worth it. She said, even if it costs everything. The county building smelled like old carpet and fluorescent doom. Sarah walked in with Linda, carrying 3 binders of evidence and exhaustion so deep it felt like bone marrow. Victoria was already there, cream linen, pearls, that specific HOA president smile that looked like control wearing a mask. Her attorney beside her, expensive suit, capped teeth, the kind of lawyer who charged $800 an hour to make rich people's problems disappear. When Victoria saw Sarah, something flickered across her perfectly made-up face. Not guilt, surprise. She hadn't expected Sarah to still be standing. Hadn't expected the burned-out nurse with shaking hands to show up with evidence and attorneys, and the kind of stubborn determination that comes from having nothing left to lose. The Board of Supervisors meeting room was packed, every seat filled, standing room only, reporters lined the back wall. Other victims of Desert Vista people Sarah had never met sat in the gallery, their presence a silent testimony to Victoria's pattern of destruction. The board chair called the meeting to order. We're here to review allegations of fraud in the Extended Wellness District approval process. Miss Vasquez, you have 30 minutes. Linda stood. She didn't waste time with pleasantries or legal theater. She went straight for the jugular. Members of the board, Desert Vista Estates HOA, has engaged in systematic fraud to expand their jurisdiction over county property. The Extended Wellness District was approved 18 months ago by Commissioner Robert Hartwell. She pointed at him where he sat, pale and sweating. Whose wife Victoria Hartwell is the HOA president who directly benefits from this expansion. She pulled up her first slide. A map showing Desert Vista's original boundaries versus the new Extended Wellness District that conveniently stretched exactly to Sarah's property line. This approval was granted without proper public notice, without notification to affected property owners, and with fabricated environmental justification. Linda's voice was surgical. This is an email from Victoria Hartwell to her husband, dated the 15th of March, 2024. Once you push through the wellness zone expansion, we can target the horse property. She's a single woman running a nonprofit. She won't have resources to fight. The room went silent. Someone in the gallery gasped. Victoria's attorney stood. This is taken completely out of context. This, Linda continued, pulling up audio on the courtroom speakers, is a recording from an HOA board meeting where Mrs. Hartwell explicitly discusses forcing closure of Safe Haven Ranch to acquire the property for Phase 4 expansion. Victoria's voice filled the room, cold, calculated, discussing Sarah's ranch like it was already theirs, like 16 therapy horses and dozens of vulnerable clients were just obstacles to profit. The horse facility is a blight and a liability. Once we force compliance or closure, that land becomes available for Phase 4 expansion. Roberts already preliminary approved the zone change. The board members' expressions shifted from polite attention to something harder, colder. Linda presented for 28 minutes. Every piece of evidence laid out like an autopsy: the forged environmental reports, the fake county violations, the pattern of targeting 3 other properties in exactly the same way. Financial records showing Desert Vista had purchased those properties after extended legal difficulties forced the owners to sell at losses. Then she showed the tire tracks from the night of the fire, matched to a truck registered to Victoria's husband. Security footage from a Desert Vista resident showing that truck leaving the development at 1:47 a.m. the night of the fire. And finally, the email Victoria to Robert sent the day before the fire. Once the horse property burns, we can move on. Phase 4. Are you sure Fire Marshal won't investigate too closely? She'd written it down. Actually, documented her intent to commit arson and her expectation that the investigation would be controlled. The board chair's jaw tightened with each slide. When Linda finished, he looked at Robert Hartwell. "Commissioner, do you have a response to these allegations?" Robert stood slowly. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the last hour. I believed I was acting in the community's best interest. My wife assured me the wellness zone expansion was necessary for public health and environmental protection. His voice cracked. I didn't realize she was manipulating me to facilitate property acquisition. Did you disclose your conflict of interest? The chair asked. No. Did you notify affected property owners before approving the boundary expansion? No. My wife said it was just a technical correction, that no one would be impacted. But people were impacted. The chair said quietly, Miss Mitchell's ranch was deliberately targeted using your approved zoning change as legal cover. Robert sank into his chair, head in hands. The chair turned to Victoria. Mrs. Hartwell, do you have anything to say? Victoria stood. For a moment, Sarah saw something crack in her perfect composure, a flash of genuine emotion that looked almost like fear. Then the mask slid back into place. Everything I've done, Victoria said, voice shaking slightly, was to protect property values and maintain community standards. Desert Vista Estates is a model development, safe, clean, valuable. That ranch, she gestured dismissively at Sarah, was a risk. Unsanitary conditions, inadequate safety measures, vulnerable populations exposed to dangerous animals. The horses aren't dangerous, Sarah said quietly from her seat. Victoria's head snapped toward her. 16 large animals creating noise, odors, attracting flies and vermin. Creating healing, Sarah interrupted, standing now. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. Those horses help veterans with PTSD sleep again. They help kids with autism learn to communicate. They help trauma survivors remember what trust feels like. That's not a risk, Mrs. Hartwell. That's the exact opposite of what you've built, a place where broken things are thrown away instead of healed. The room was absolutely silent. Victoria's face twisted. You think you're special because you help people? I built an entire community, 300 families, jobs, value, structure, order. What have you built? A nonprofit that barely breaks even? I built something that matters more than money, Sarah said. That's what scares you. I'm not scared of you. Yes, you are, Sarah said quietly, because I'm everything you're not. I don't need to control people to feel powerful. I don't need to destroy things to feel successful. And that terrifies you, because it means there's another way to live, and you chose wrong. Victoria's face went white, then red. Her attorney grabbed her arm, tried to pull her down, but she shook him off. You're nobody, Victoria spat. A divorced nurse playing cowgirl on land you can't afford to maintain. I offered to buy you out fairly, You offered to buy me out after you tried to burn me alive, Sarah said, her voice still quiet but carrying the weight of 16 horses she'd pulled from flames. After you strung barbed wire at my animal's water source. After you manufactured county violations. After you used your husband's position to falsify zoning records. That's not a fair offer, Mrs. Hartwell. That's extortion disguised as business. The chair banged his gavel. That's enough. Commissioner Hartwell, you're suspended pending investigation, Mrs. Hartwell, the county is freezing all Desert Vista expansion activities and referring this matter to the district attorney for criminal review. Victoria grabbed her purse. This is a witch hunt. This is accountability, the chair said. Meeting adjourned. Outside, reporters swarmed Sarah. Cameras, microphones. Questions shouted over each other. Linda handled most of it, but one reporter, a young woman from the Arizona Republic, asked Sarah directly, "What do you want people to know about this case?" Sarah looked at the camera, thinking about the Morrison twins, about Marcus, about every person who'd found healing at her ranch. I want people to know that HOAs are supposed to protect communities, not terrorize them. That power, without accountability, becomes tyranny, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to sell something that matters just because someone with money wants to take it. The story ran the next day. Scottsdale nurse defeats HOA in land fraud case, but it was the editorial that made Sarah cry, a piece by a columnist who'd lost her own property to HOA harassment 3 years earlier. Sarah Mitchell didn't just save her ranch, she exposed a system that allows petty tyrants with clipboards to destroy lives. She proved that fighting back is possible. That's worth more than any property value. The phone calls started immediately. Other HOA victims, attorneys wanting to file similar cases, advocacy groups asking Sarah to speak at conferences. "You're becoming a symbol," Linda said during their debrief. The person who stood up and won. "I don't feel like I won," Sarah admitted. "My barn still burned. I still wake up smelling smoke. My hands still shake. And it cost $80,000 in donations just to rebuild." "You're alive," Linda said. "Your horses are alive. Victoria's going to prison. That's winning." "Then why does it feel like I lost something I can't get back?" Linda was quiet for a moment. "Because you did. You lost the innocence of thinking property rights mean anything when rich people want what's yours. You lost the belief that following the rules keeps you safe. But Sarah, those things were illusions anyway. What you gained is real. You proved you could fight and survive. That's worth more than innocence." 3 weeks after the board meeting, Victoria was arrested. The news showed her being led from her house in handcuffs, yoga pants, pearls, face frozen in shocked disbelief that the rules finally applied to her. Charges: arson, conspiracy to commit fraud, abuse of public office, racketeering. Her husband Robert took a plea deal, probation, and testimony against Victoria in exchange for avoiding prison time. The trial was set for October. Sarah should have felt vindicated. Instead, she had a panic attack while feeding horses. Full breakdown, hyperventilating in the barn aisle, hands shaking so badly she dropped the feed bucket, vision tunneling until Marcus found her sitting in the dirt, unable to breathe. "I can't do this," she gasped between sobs. "Can't rebuild. Can't fight anymore. Can't even feed horses without falling apart." "Yes, you can," Marcus said quietly. Sat beside her in the dirt, didn't try to fix it, just sat. "You know how I know? Because you taught me how. When I first came here, I was so broken. I couldn't sleep, couldn't drive without hyperventilating, couldn't be around people without panicking. You told me something I didn't believe then, but I believe now. Healing isn't about not being broken. It's about learning to live while you're still putting pieces back together." Sarah looked at him through tears. "What if the pieces don't fit anymore? Then you build something new with the pieces you have left," he said. "That's what you taught me. That's what the horses teach everyone. You don't have to be whole to be valuable. You just have to keep showing up." That night, Sarah went back to the burn site, stood where the barn used to be, looked at ash and destruction and forced herself to see it clearly, not as failure, but as the price of standing up. Her phone buzzed. Email from someone named Jennifer Park. Miss Mitchell, I worked for Victoria for 3 years. I have evidence you need. They met at a Starbucks. Jennifer, mid-20s, exhausted, carrying guilt like stones, slid a laptop across the table. This is everything, she said. 3 years of emails, financial records, recorded board meetings, Victoria discussing problem neighbors, Robert coordinating zone changes, plans to target your property specifically. Why are you giving me this? Jennifer's voice broke. Because my little brother has autism. He's like, those kids at your ranch, needs horses more than words. 2 years ago, someone burned down a therapeutic riding center near us. 16 dogs died. My brother still has nightmares. She wiped her eyes. I watched Victoria plan the same thing to you. I stayed silent because I needed the job. Because I was afraid. Because I told myself it wasn't my problem. And now I can't look at my brother without seeing those dogs. Without seeing your horses, I can't be the person who stayed silent anymore. Sarah reached across the table, covered Jennifer's hand with her scarred one. Thank you. This took courage. No, Jennifer said. Courage would have been speaking up sooner. This is just the bare minimum of being human. Linda called the evidence prosecutorial gold. Martin Torres, the retired FBI agent who'd been documenting Desert Vista, called it enough to put Victoria away for a decade. The county attorney agreed. Updated charges to include RICO conspiracy using an organization to commit pattern of crimes, fraud, arson, extortion. But building the case meant Sarah had to relive everything. Depositions, document review, walking through the burned barn with investigators while explaining exactly where she'd found each horse, which beams had collapsed, how close she'd come to dying. Her PTSD got worse. Nightmares every night, panic attacks triggered by smoke, smells, sirens, even the sound of crackling fire in a campfire. Doctor. Reyes increased their sessions to twice weekly. You're experiencing delayed trauma response, Dr. Reyes explained. In the ER, you could compartmentalize, push through, save the breakdown for later. But now there's no emergency to focus on, so your body is finally processing what happened. How do I make it stop? You don't. You learn to live with it, just like you're teaching your clients. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah, the healer who couldn't heal herself. The woman who taught trauma survivors to trust while having panic attacks in the barn. But slowly, painfully, she did learn. Marcus taught her the breathing techniques he'd learned for combat PTSD. The Morrison twins' mother, a therapist, suggested EMDR. Dr. Chen provided medication for the worst nights, and the horses, as always, provided the thing medicine couldn't: presence. Juniper would rest her head on Sarah's shoulder during panic attacks. Thunder would stand quietly beside her until the shaking stopped. They didn't try to fix her. They just existed alongside the brokenness until it became bearable. The trial came in October, 6 months after the fire. Sarah walked into the Maricopa County Superior Court with Linda, Martin, and 20 supporters wearing Save Safe Haven t-shirts. The media packed the gallery. Sketch artists positioned themselves for dramatic angles. Victoria sat at the defense table in a navy suit, hair perfect, face composed. But Sarah could see the cracks now: weight loss, shadows under carefully applied concealer, hands that gripped a pen too tightly. The prosecution opened with the arson. Brought in the fire investigator who'd found 3 distinct points of origin, all near hay storage, all with traces of accelerant. This was not an electrical fire, he testified. This was deliberate arson designed to look accidental, but executed by someone unfamiliar with fire investigation techniques. Victoria's lawyer cross-examined aggressively. Couldn't those 3 points of origin be consistent with electrical malfunction in 3 separate circuits? Not with the burn patterns we documented, not with the accelerant traces, and certainly not with the timeline. 3 locations igniting within minutes of each other isn't electrical failure. It's arson. The prosecution presented tire track evidence, security footage showing Robert Hartwell's truck leaving Desert Vista at 1:47 a.m. gas station footage of the same truck buying a gas can at 11:30 p.m. the night before the fire. Then they played the email. Victoria to Robert, sent at 3:14 p.m. the day before the fire. Tonight, make sure it looks electrical. Fire marshal owes us he won't look too closely. The jury's expressions shifted from polite attention to disgust. Victoria's lawyer tried damage control. My client was venting frustration, not planning arson. This email, taken out of context. The prosecution interrupted. The context is a fire that happened exactly 8 hours after this email was sent. Using the method your client explicitly described, that's not context, that's premeditation. Day 2 brought victim testimony. The first property owner, Victoria, had targeted testified about suspicious electrical fires at his workshop. The second described chemical contamination of her, well. The third voice breaking talked about the rescue dogs who died when his shelter burned. 16 dogs, he said quietly. I got 12 out. 4 didn't make it. Fire department said it was electrical, but I'd had the whole building rewired 3 months before. And the week before the fire, Victoria Hartwell offered to buy my property for development. The pattern was undeniable. On day 3, Jennifer Park testified. Young, nervous, but resolute. Mrs. Hartwell explicitly planned to force Miss Mitchell out through harassment, violations, and, if necessary, destruction of property, Jennifer said, reading from her notes. I have emails where she discusses problem properties and strategies to encourage relocation. I have board meeting recordings where she and her husband coordinate zoning changes to facilitate acquisitions. And I have text messages where she tells him, quote, the horse lady won't sell. Time for Plan B. What was Plan B? The prosecutor asked. Arson, Jennifer said. Make it look like misquote. Mitchell's negligence caused the fire, force her to sell to cover damages. Victoria's lawyer tore into Jennifer on cross-examination. You worked for my client for 3 years, correct? Yes. And you're only coming forward now because? Because I'm ashamed I didn't speak up sooner, or because Miss Mitchell's attorneys offered you immunity. They offered immunity after I contacted them, Jennifer said firmly. I came forward because my conscience wouldn't let me stay silent after watching 16 horses almost die. On day 4, Sarah testified. She walked to the witness stand with hands that shook, despite medication and breathing exercises. The prosecutor, a woman named Rebecca Orozco with kind eyes, started gently. Miss Mitchell, can you describe what happened the night of March 12th? Sarah's voice was steady at first. Described the alarm, running to the barn, the flames, pulling horses out one by one. Then Rebecca asked, how did you feel when you realized your barn was burning? And Sarah broke. Not dramatically, just tears running down her face while she tried to keep talking. I thought I was going to lose them. All of them. 16 horses trapped in stalls. I could hear them screaming, and I knew if I didn't get them out, they'd die, terrified, and I couldn't. She couldn't finish the sentence, just sat there crying while the courtroom waited. Rebecca handed her tissues. Take your time. Sarah wiped her face. Sorry, I'm a nurse. I'm supposed to be professional. You're human, Rebecca said gently. Did you get all the horses out? Yes, all 16. At what cost? Sarah held up her hands, scarred from burns, still shaking. I can't stop the tremors anymore. I have PTSD, panic attacks, nightmares. I can't sleep without medication. Can't be around fire without hyperventilating. She looked directly at Victoria. But the horses are alive, and that's worth it. Victoria's lawyer cross-examined. Tried to suggest Sarah's negligence caused the fire, tried to paint her as an unreliable witness whose PTSD made her testimony questionable. But he made a mistake. He asked, Isn't it possible, Miss Mitchell, that your emotional state is causing you to misinterpret events? That the fire was truly an accident and you're simply looking for someone to blame? Sarah looked at him for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was nurse calm. the tone she used in the ER when explaining to families that their loved one wasn't going to make it. "I've spent 23 years in emergency medicine," she said. "I know the difference between accident and intent. I know what evidence looks like. I know how to document injuries and determine cause. This was not an accident. This was attempted murder of my horses, my livelihood, and possibly me. And your client planned it in writing." The lawyer had no response. The jury deliberated 8 hours. Sarah spent it in the courthouse cafeteria, unable to eat, unable to think, just breathing and trying not to imagine what would happen if Victoria walked free. When the bailiff called them back, Sarah's hands were shaking so badly Linda had to help her stand. The jury foreman was an older woman, grandmother-type, kind face. She looked at Sarah once, just once, and something in her expression said, "I believe you." Then she read the verdict. On the charge of arson, we find the defendant guilty. On conspiracy to commit fraud, guilty. On abuse of public office, guilty. On racketeering under RICO statute, guilty. 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 16 counts, 16 guilty verdicts. Sarah didn't feel triumph, didn't feel vindication. Just bone-deep exhaustion and something that might eventually become relief. Victoria sat frozen, face blank. Her lawyer whispered urgently, but she wasn't listening. She was staring at nothing, watching her kingdom collapse one guilty verdict at a time. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. Victoria got 4 years federal prison, $500,000 restitution, permanent ban from HOA governance. Sarah attended with Linda, Marcus, the Morrison twins' family, and 24 others from Safe Haven Ranch. They sat in the gallery while the judge explained that Victoria's crimes had been premeditated, calculated, and caused immeasurable harm to multiple families. "You used your position of authority to terrorize people," the judge said. "You used your husband's public office to commit fraud, and you attempted to murder 16 therapy animals because they were inconvenient to your development plans. These crimes demonstrate exceptional callousness and premeditation. 4 years is the minimum sentence I can impose. I wish it were more." Victoria was led out in handcuffs. She didn't look at Sarah, didn't look at anyone, just walked out like she was already gone. After, Sarah stood on the courthouse steps with the Arizona sunset painting everything copper gold. Reporters asked questions she barely heard. Linda handled most of it. One reporter, the young woman from the Arizona Republic who'd written the editorial, asked, "How does justice feel?" Sarah thought about that, about the barn that was rebuilt but would never be the same, about the horses who'd survived but still spooked at smoke, about her hands that wouldn't stop shaking, about Victoria, who'd destroyed herself trying to control something that was never hers to take. "Justice feels complicated," she said finally. "I'm glad Victoria was held accountable. But I'm sad it came to this. Sad that someone chose destruction over creation, chose control over community. I don't hate her. I pity her. Because she spent her whole life building fences and never learned that the most valuable things can't be contained." That night, Sarah wrote a letter she'd never send. "Victoria, you saw my ranch as something to eliminate. I see your prison sentence as something to mourn. Not because you don't deserve it, you do, but because you chose this. You could have chosen differently at any moment, could have chosen community over control, healing over destruction. But you looked at broken things and decided they needed to be thrown away instead of fixed. I hope prison teaches you what horses taught me, that strength isn't about controlling others. That power isn't about bending people to your will, that the only thing worth building is something that makes the world gentler for broken things. My horses will go on healing people. Your HOA will be dissolved, your legacy dismantled. In the end, I built something that matters. What did you build, besides your own prison?" She folded it, put it in a drawer, and walked outside to watch the desert night settle over Safe Haven Ranch. 6 months later, The ranch had been transformed. New barn fireproof materials, sprinkler systems, solar panels that made Sarah think about rebuilding in more ways than one, horses back in routine. Calendar fully booked with therapy sessions. The Morrison twins were speaking in full sentences now, entirely because of their weekly time with Daisy. Marcus had started training to become a volunteer instructor. The teenage assault survivor was teaching a workshop on equine therapy for other trauma survivors, and Sarah's hands didn't shake anymore. Not every day, anyway. She stood in the barn doorway at sunrise, watching Juniper graze in the paddock, and felt her chest unclench in a way it hadn't since before the fire. Doctor. Chen, the vet who'd fought her own HOA, stopped by for a wellness check. They sat on Sarah's porch, drinking coffee, watching horses graze. You know what's interesting? Doctor, Chen said, I've gotten 3 calls from people in my old neighborhood who are finally standing up to their HOA. Your case showed them it's possible. That fighting back doesn't mean automatic destruction. I almost lost everything, Sarah said, but you didn't, and that matters more than you know. That evening, Sarah walked the property alone, past the barn that rose from ash, past horses who'd survived fire, past land that was finally, completely, legally hers. She thought about Victoria serving year 2 of her sentence, about Robert, who'd lost his career and marriage, about the system that had allowed 2 people to terrorize multiple families until one person said no. She thought about justice and mercy and the difference between them. And she thought about that moment in the burning barn, pulling Butterfly out while the roof collapsed, when she'd known with absolute certainty that she was going to die, but kept moving anyway because some things matter more than safety. Juniper walked over, rested her gray muzzle on Sarah's shoulder. The same gesture from the night of the fire: trust, connection. The thing Victoria had tried to destroy but couldn't. Sarah's hand, scarred but steady, stroked the mare's neck. They tried to burn us out, she whispered to the desert wind. Somewhere, a coyote answered. The last light bled from behind the Superstition Mountains. Stars began appearing one by one, in a sky that remembered what fire looked like and chose darkness instead. And Safe Haven Ranch, scarred, rebuilt, unbreakable, breathed in the night like something that had always been meant to survive. Because that's what healing looks like. Not perfection, but persistence. Not victory without scars, but showing up despite them. Not fearlessness, but doing the terrifying thing anyway because it matters. Sarah Mitchell had learned that in the ER. The horses had confirmed it. And Victoria Hartwell, locked in a cage built by her own need for control, would spend 4 years discovering it was true. Freedom doesn't come from fences or rules or controlling what your neighbors do. It comes from building something so real that even fire can't destroy what it means. 6 months later, Safe Haven Ranch reopened. New barn fireproof materials, sprinkler systems, built by volunteers and donations, horses back in routine, kids learning to trust again. Sarah stood in the barn doorway at sunrise, watching Juniper graze in the paddock, and felt her hands steady for the first time in months. Not healed, but healing. Marcus walked up beside her. You did it. We did it. No, he said quietly. You taught us how. That's different, Doctor. Chen, the vet who'd fought her own HOA, stopped by that afternoon. I've gotten calls from 3 people in my old neighborhood finally standing up to their HOA. Your story gave them permission to stop being afraid. Sarah thought about that. About fear and courage and the difference between them. I was terrified the whole time, she admitted. I know, that's why it mattered. As sunset painted the Superstition Mountains purple gold, Sarah walked the property one last time, past the new barn, past horses that had survived fire, past land that was finally, legally, completely hers. She thought about Victoria locked in a cell built by her own need for control, about the 8 months of hell that had somehow led to this moment, about learning that sometimes surviving is the same thing as winning. Juniper walked over and rested her gray muzzle on Sarah's shoulder, the same gesture from the night of the fire: trust, connection. the thing Victoria had tried to destroy but couldn't because some bonds are stronger than flames. Sarah's hands scarred, but steady stroked the mare's neck. "They tried to burn us out," she whispered to the desert wind. The horse's ear flicked. Somewhere, a coyote sang. The last light bled from the sky, and Safe Haven Ranch breathed in the darkness like something that had always been meant to survive.